Hello and welcome to episode 89 of the Page One podcast. I'm Marco.
I'm Tarek.
And thanks for joining us at the Page One podcast, where we like to speak to writers of all kinds about their writing careers, how they broke into the industry, and try and get as many hints and tips from them as possible. And as you will have heard, Tarek has decided to turn up for this week's introduction.
I thought we were off last week. I turned up and you've done an episode without me.
It's all right. The numbers for last week's episode are the best we've had for a while. So I think I see a pattern here. What did you do with your time off, Tarek?
I went on holiday for a week down to the borders. It was very nice. It was
nice. First
holiday with the little one, so didn't get
Not
anywhere
really
near as
holiday,
much sleep as I was hoping. Yeah, exactly.
I will let you introduce our great guest for this week.
Oh, this week we've got a really exciting guest. Dominic Nolan we're chatting with, who is the author of the Abigail Boone novels, Past Life and After Dark, but his most recent novel, Vine Street, is a historical thriller based on real events in 1930s Soho, and it has been smashing it since it came out just a few days ago. It's been let me double check exactly, Times Crime Book of the Month, which is a pretty big deal.
Yeah, it's been getting rave reviews, and quite rightly. It's a really... He talks to us in detail about the idea behind it and the setting, and it sounds like a very complicated novel to have pulled all those threads together. And he actually talks to us about when he first pitched it to his editor, and it clearly wasn't settled in his head as an idea, because the pitch didn't go quite as well. But I won't say anything else at this stage, because Dom does tell us in the podcast. Yeah,
it's a really fun chat with Dominic, and he also touches on the thorny issue of rejection, and he's had a number of false starts before he really gets his feet, and it's something which a lot of people have to struggle with, and it's nice to kind of normalize that part of the process a bit, I think.
Yeah.
So it's a really good chat. It's a lot of fun. It's got a good dry sense of humour, Dominic, I think it's fair to say.
No, it does. We'll get straight into it after a quick advert for our writer's notebook, and then we'll be back at the end of the podcast with a bit more chat and to let you know about next week's guest.
But for now, on with the podcast.
The blank page. To some, it's terrifying, an obstacle to overcome. But we prefer to think of it as an opportunity, a blank canvas to be filled with all of the adventures and characters in our head. So how to overcome that fear? Well, we all know the best advice for a writer is write. Seriously, get words on the page and more will follow.
But what about later, when you start trying to pull those threads of what you've written together? What about the character you wrote about way back at the start? Who was she again? What was she carrying? And where did she leave the MacGuffin that she now really needs in the third act? Think about all those top thrillers you like to read, or that amazing drama you just watched. What did they all have in common? Structure and planning.
As aspiring writers ourselves, we've tried many different methods to try and organise all the thoughts about the stories we want to tell. We've been there searching for a piece of scrap paper to note something down, or making a quick note on our phone in between meetings.
Or sometimes we'll make a note in whatever notebook we're carrying, or a document on our laptop so we don't forget that great idea. Let's be honest, it can all be a bit messy and it's easy to lose track of everything. And that's when we realised it's not just a story that needs structure and planning, but the way we gather all of our thoughts about it as well.
And so we made Page One. Page One is more than just another notebook. It's a place to put down all your ideas for your latest project, divided into easy-to-use sections that will help you plan your story, so that when that blank page comes calling, you're ready to answer. And then afterwards, once it's written, we realised you need to plan how to let people read it, so we included a section relating to submissions.
Each one is designed for one project, whether you want to write a book, screenplay, a comic, or any other kind of story. We truly believe that when you use it, it will help you get to the main event, writing your story. So we hope this helps.
We can't wait to read what you come up with.
And remember, every story starts with Page One.
Did you always want to be a writer?
Yes and no. I was very interested in film in my teens and was convinced I was going to be the North London Stanley Kubrick. I got involved in that for a while. I did some film courses, and this was sort of pre-HD, pre-digital revolution. So it meant mucking around on 16mm and getting Steinbeck machines to cut them on, or doing it on 8mm with a pair of scissors and sellotape, which wasn't exactly cutting edge. But it's a thing that requires a lot of hard work to get into, a lot of working with others on other projects and starting at the bottom. And I think during that time, I kind of knew I wanted to write, but the idea of writing 300 pages in one go felt like crossing a desert blindfolded or something. Like it just wasn't something that I felt was sort of in my wheelhouse. And for years, I just worked day jobs. And then I went back to school, back to university to do creative writing, purely to get some kind of structure into my writing. And, the sort of mortification of missing deadlines, I figured would inspire me to be more writing than I was. And then gradually you start writing longer and longer pieces. And then it was like, yeah, okay, I think I can have a go at this. And I sit down and try and write my first novel.
And did that attempt at the first novel, once you had something that you were happy with, presumably you started trying to submit it to places and things like that? I mean, how was that process for you?
Mine was pretty straightforward, because when I was at university, they kind of did a little anthology every year just with students' work, and there was a vice chancellor's prize, and they asked an agent to judge it every year, and I won in my final year.
Nice.
And got to meet Nicola Barr, who's my agent. So I didn't actually have to really submit at all. I had
fantastic.
to her, and she took me on. Well, she actually she gave me a card. They had like an evening, like an event for the thing. She gave me a card and was like, give me a call, get in contact, and we'll sort something out. I thought she meant when I had a book. So like a year later or something, I've sort of turned up with this 600-page monstrosity, like, hi, remember me? And she was like, no, I meant like call me next week kind of thing. And we'd have sorted it out back then. But she took me on anyway. That was 2010, maybe. I think I met her in 2008, and it took about another year. So it was like early 2010.
So how much of the book had you written was it like a kind of pitch thing, or did you show like a sample of the work when you won the prize?
No, I mean, I was just talking to her that night, and I said I'd started something and was, beavering away. Wasn't sure how long it would take, because, I mean, my first novel anyway, I felt was very much an apprenticeship work, I think. I mean, like, I'd done the creative writing at university, but you don't learn anywhere near as much doing that as you do writing your first novel. That's where you kind of work out what kind of habits, what processes work for you and what don't. And back then I was writing first drafts longhand. I did a couple of novels like that, so I've got huge folders, pages and pages of handwritten. I can't even begin to imagine doing that now. So it was a fairly long process writing it, and then using the sort of transcribing of it as part of the editorial process as I went along. The first novel probably took me a couple of years, all in all. So I was maybe halfway through it when I spoke to Nicola the first time, and then delivered it to her later on. It didn't sell. It was a historical thing. It was set in the 19th century against the backdrop of the swing riots, which were probably the closest we came to a popular revolution in the last few hundred years in this country. Certainly on the back of the French and Belgian sort of overthrowing governments every 5 minutes back then. It sort of had 7 narrative lines that it sort of weaved through back. I mean, it was an unmade bed. It was unbelievable.
But there must have been enough in there that obviously she hadn't read any of your work when you went to see her a year later with this book, and so there must have been enough in there that she thought. And what you say, it was like 600 pages, so presumably it was chopped right down. But she obviously saw something in there that was like, this guy's got actual writing skill. Yeah,
I mean, I think she liked. I mean, it was a short story she'd read of mine in university that made her interested in the first place. And I guess she thought I had voice, as people say, which is probably evident there's probably too much voice, to be honest, in my first novel. Like a lot of early novels, I think it strays into the realm of purple quite often, and shows, I think, and you can't quite get rid of the people you like reading out of your own writing early on. So if you imagine a very, very drunk Cormac McCarthy rewriting English history,
that sounds pretty good, actually.
I went back and looked at some of it not too long ago and cried. It would take a lot of work, I think, for me to be happy with it again these days. But I mean, it went out and people. It wasn't like it just got sort of generic refusals left and right. There were people interested. It went to an acquisitions table at one major publisher. But it probably did need work, and it was a little bit odd. So it would have needed to be somebody massively in love with it, I think, to push it, and that didn't quite happen. But as a learning experience, it was invaluable, I think. And also at that time, even now to some extent, the actual publication of the book seemed like some weird abstract thing that was completely disconnected for me from the writing of it. Like, I just love the writing of it. I love sitting at a desk, love getting into a story. And it was almost like, okay, it's not going to sell. That's fine. I can just do whatever I want for the next one. And that was the process for, the best part of a decade before Past Life sold.
So yeah, I was going to bring up Past Life. And what do you think, having gone through that experience with your first novel, and then presumably there was stuff in between, what do you think it was about Past Life that suddenly made it sellable to these publishers?
I think, my early novels were failures in that how I view fiction now, what I think makes a good novel, I hadn't done completely back then. I don't think they quite hung together. They didn't cohere, I guess, to any larger design. So they were very patchy. And we'd submitted three or four novels that hadn't sold. And I'd been writing something for probably 2.5 years that it was like the opposite of writer's block, but I couldn't get away from it. I couldn't quite finish it, but I kept on going back and rewriting all of it. So I had kind of 4 different versions of essentially 65,000 words, but also completely different, like just completely different tellings of the same story. And I just couldn't stop myself doing it. Like, I kept on saying, okay, I'll move on from that. And then it would creep back into my head when I was like 20 pages into something else. And then I'd go back to it and I'll just rewrite all of this because it's great. And it wasn't. It was awful. And in the end, I had to delete it, like, permanently, just get rid of all of it, because the temptation to go back and keep on, I'd still be there now, like the 17th version of it. And while I was writing the last version of it, I'd come up with Boone. I don't know where she came from, and started to marry the character to different ideas, particularly the memory loss concept, which was interesting to me. Sort of the nexus of memory and personhood. Who are we if we're completely unmoored from our past and don't remember anything? And I felt that was a story. I kind of saw the whole thing. I was like, I can finish that. So I just scrubbed this other thing off my hard drive, sat down and wrote Past Life in probably just over 3 months or something.
And so you'd am I right in saying then you'd done 5 books and you'd written them and you'd edited them and you'd put them out to publication, but they hadn't gone anywhere. And then Past Life came along. I mean that's a really good story of perseverance, and and knowing that, like, I've still not hit the idea of the book that I need to do. And it sounds like when Past Life came to you that was it something about it you thought this is the one which is going to sell more than others?
I didn't at all. I mean, I sent it in. Nicola liked it and thought she could sell it, and then did. But I mean, these things are. You only need one person to say yes. I mean, that sounds trite, but only one person ever has said yes to me. Do you know what I mean? Past Life didn't sell at auction, or it wasn't preempted. We had one offer. That was it. So there's only one editor who's ever said yes to me. And even he said no before. So rejection isn't something you can get hung up on. You can't take it personally, because it is publishing. And it will be publishing even after you're published. You might not get the reviews you want in newspapers, so you're rejected in that way. Or you might not end up on a shortlist you thought you might end up on, you're rejected in that way. Or readers might not like it, you get rejected in that way. Or another manuscript you write might get rejected even after you've been published. I mean, rejection is just a daily part of the business. And I think if you let that become the important thing, you're in trouble. You've got to learn to cope with that pretty quickly. And I didn't even use it as fuel. Rejection just didn't seem to bother me. the experience of the early novels not selling. To me, it was just what I was doing was writing. If it ever got sold, that was gravy. If it didn't, there was always going to be another book, or 16 versions of the same book, whatever. But I mean, Past Life was, in that way, it was almost a palate cleanser. It was a way I was clearing my own system out. And I mean, I hadn't really written, I guess, what you'd call straight up crime fiction before that. A lot of my early books were period and sort of broad canvas stuff, more like Vine Street, to be honest, than the Boone novels.
Mm-hmm.
But I love crime fiction. So I kind of made the deliberate move at that point to write something like what I read, I guess, on a regular basis. And just because I could see the whole thing, I thought that seems a relatively straightforward process. I can just sit down and write that now. Mm-hmm. I mean, the first draft was longer and a little bit baggier, and we sat down, me and my agent, and carved probably 20,000 words out of it. And then that went on submission, and like I said, got a lot of rejections. I also find rejections from publishers interesting, because most of them will make comments. They won't just say, that's not for me.
Yeah.
You'll get, I mean, obviously sometimes that can depend on your agent's relationship with them, but I tended to get comments, which is helpful, particularly if you start to get a consensus. But then equally, the rejections around Past Life had a consensus, but it did sell to a major imprint. So, what you make of that, like I said, a lot of it's timing, a lot of it's editors' opinions, and opinions at different times. A lot of it. I mean, my editor had only just moved into his position, which was his first editorial position. So if we'd submitted kind of 3 months earlier, or maybe even 3 months later, we might have got him at a different time, and then that's up in the air. So
yeah,
the element of luck involved in any of it in publishing is unbelievable.
Yeah, and when you came up with this this idea for what to do with this character Boone, Abigail Boone, that you created, was it a self-contained idea, or did you have, because obviously she appears in your second book as well, Afterlife. What was it? Did you always have the idea that you would be able to revisit and explore further with her?
Yes and no. I didn't have a plan. I mean, when I sat down to write it, it was just that. But there was a lot of ideas I had that I ended up either not putting in or cutting out from Past Life. And there was enough of it there where I thought that could be another novel. And through the process of writing Past Life, and then when I'd submitted it, I kind of already put together what could be. I mean, I knew when we put it on submission that if it sold, more than likely a publisher would say, we'll have another one of those.
Yeah.
I mean, you usually end up with at least a 2-book deal to start with. So I put together an idea, which was, I mean, the plan I had was very close to what happened with After Dark. So we were ready to go when we went in to headline sort of first meeting. Yeah. But I also knew it wasn't something that I was going to run out into a sort of a 8 or 9 book. There just wasn't really the potential. There's only so much crazy stuff can happen, I think, to one person who's not a detective. It's one thing a detective working cases, but a sort of a mad 9-fingered woman rustling sheep and stuff, it isn't something that you can sort of repeat too many times. So I knew it was going to be limited in that way.
And what sort of research do you do when you're looking at a book like this? Something about amnesia, you've got memory loss, you've got the real science there. Obviously you want to look at that and make sure you get that right, but how right do you want to be, and how much do you want to box yourself in or leave yourself no room for creative control?
Yeah, I mean, I will always go with the creative control over a fact. If a fact is bad, I'll change it to suit myself. The thing with that kind of memory loss is it's so rare, and the cases that have been documented have had such a variety of outcomes. Like, some people get their memory back and keep on losing it periodically. Some people never get it back, but are found by people who know them. Some of them never get it back and are never found by anybody who knew them. So given the range of possibilities, it was basically, I had that freedom to more or less play it however I wanted. And I was suitably vague in terms of what the cause of the whole thing was medically anyway. Just, don't write yourself into a corner. in that respect, I think was my philosophy.
And obviously, they were both, really well reviewed and received. I mean, I saw comparisons to authors like Rankin, Peter May, Michael Connolly. How did that feel after, a decade of trying to get something published, or does that not bother you at all, that sort of thing?
I think when you get it from other writers, I think that's valuable.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of like your peers reviewing what you're doing. I mean, in terms of, you're not going to get a bad review from the press because they just wouldn't publish a review. You'd have to be a writer of some stature for a newspaper to actually say this is worth writing a bad review of. So either which way, you're winning there, because you're either huge enough to get a bad review or you're just not getting a bad one. And I mean, in terms of Amazon reviews, that's just the Wild West, isn't it? You don't venture there. That's not territory to be in unarmed, I don't think. But I mean, it's nice getting a newspaper. I mean, you take the sales over reviews any time, though.
Yeah.
Anyway, come buy a house with reviews.
when you I want to chat a bit about the process that you have when you actually come to write as well. And so, when you sit down to put pen to paper, as it was, or words on the screen now, but do you plan it out in advance? Do you do a lot of plotting, or do you just kind of have a rough idea and roll with it?
No, I like to have a roadmap. I can't really, structure is important to me, how I'm going to structure the book. So I like to have at least, I mean, I can ignore it when I get into it, but I'd like to have a sketched out plan before I start to give myself a vision of what I'm looking at. Mm-hmm. Also, I think because the way I feel about fiction, the things that are important to me when writing it, make having a plan important, because I think fiction, when it's done well, is designed to be more than the sum of its parts. And I would find it personally incredibly difficult to do that on the fly. And I think, I don't know, I get the impression that, like, pantsers, as you might call them, they essentially do planning, they just do it after they've done the writing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than before. So it's really only a case of when you're doing it, and I prefer to do it beforehand, because I don't like doing a good deal of rewriting. Rewriting annoys me. I'd rather do planning than going through a manuscript over and over and over again. So when I actually sit down and write what I call the working draft, I may only do like 1,000 words a day, but that 1,000 words will be pretty much what you'll see in the book at the end. There won't be that much changed in terms of the actual writing. Any changes I make will tend to be either plot points or something like that, something that I need to finesse.
So are you revising that as you write on that day, or is it something you do?
The rewriting is baked in basically on that day.
Yeah.
So, I'll write a couple of paragraphs and then immediately go back through it and make sure it flows, and make sure there's a sort of, that cadence you like in your writing that's there and then, so that I won't have to return to it and do any heavy lifting on that later on. I'd rather get that out of the way initially.
So it sounds like by the time, it's maybe a slower process getting through that first draft, but by the time you finish it, that's almost like you've done a few drafts, as you go type of thing. Yeah,
that working draft won't be a million miles away from what we end up publishing. It varies from book to book. Like I said, when I did Past Life, me and my agent probably worked on it before submission for a couple of months. But that's because, you haven't got a deal. So you do more work with your agent before it goes out, because it has to be properly polished when it goes out to editors. And then it really didn't change. The work I did with my editor was pretty light touch. It was a luxury because we just ended up working on character stuff. In fact, the book got a little bit longer at that point, which is unusual. And with After Dark, I had a very detailed plan I put together that I could show my editor, and then we were all on the same page. Let's go with that. So again, once that was done, there wasn't that much to change when we got there. It was just a matter of whittling away very fine details. Mm-hmm. With Vine Street was an unusual one, because I pitched Vine Street initially I handed in After Dark very, very early. So we had a big run in for Past Life anyway. We sold it summer of 17. And then obviously you have your wranglings and your contract work, whatever. So I ended up going into Headline for the first time in the October. And that was when we found out they were publishing March 19. So we had 18 months at that point, which was a huge luxury for a debut author, because you don't really have to worry about anything. You haven't got deadlines because it can't possibly say that. Do whatever you've got to do. And we had proofs then pretty early, like the following summer. And I wrote After Dark that next summer. So, you know, I was kind of expected to hand it in at the latest when Past Life was coming out. So kind of like the February, March. I hand it in like end of August, I think, start of September. My thinking being, if I totally screw the pooch on this, I've got enough time to write a whole other book. That's the kind of fear that goes through your head as a new writer. But it wasn't. That came together. So then we had a lot of time to do that. And I was already thinking about, you know, what am I going to do next? And I think at sort of near the end of that year, I was doing some other stuff like paid gigs, but I pitched Vine Street to my editor in the worst possible fashion, the worst possible fashion. I'm not big on giving advice, but if there's any advice I could give new or aspiring writers, it's when you do a pitch, at least think about it before you do it. Like, I hadn't written anything down. I haven't even arranged the thoughts in my head. I got so excited with the idea that it just started coming out. And it wasn't in any kind of way, like if you're going to pitch something to somebody who doesn't know anything about it, just blind pitching it, you need to start with the basics. You know, what's it about? Who does it happening to? Where is it happening? Instead, I'm there talking about, yeah, man, I want to write it like it's got the same rhythms as ragtime jazz and it's going to be dancing around. I must have sounded like a crazy person. And it was like a couple of minutes into it before my editor's like, wait, you're pitching a book here? Is that what's that? I'm like, yeah. Oh, and it's a crime book, by the way. There's murders and stuff. It's brilliant. So yeah, it went horribly wrong. And basically he said, no, let's leave that one alone. So then I was kind of left there. Technically, I was out of contract, or at least in terms of having delivered the two books, the two manuscripts for publication. But obviously, you've still got that relationship with your publisher because, you know, it was going to be almost 2 years until the paperback of my second book came out. But I couldn't get anything else going. Like, I had other ideas for stuff. I just didn't want to write them. Like, I wanted to write Vine Street. So like a normal person would have sat down, written a pitch that made sense, worked on it with my agent, and then gone back to my editor and said, remember that mad conversation we had before when I was drunk? Forget that ever happened. Let's start from scratch. But that would have made too much sense. So basically, I did nothing for a long time. And then After Dark came out, and we immediately went into lockdown because the world went crazy. And I just thought, I can't sit here doing nothing. So I'm going to write the thing I want to write, mostly out of spite. And if it doesn't come out, it doesn't come out. That's fine. I just need something to do. And that was incredibly liberating because I enjoyed every second of it. It was just joyous. And it took longer than, like, Past Life was about 3.5 months, and After Dark's probably about the same, probably 4 months right now, I guess. It was 9 months, I would say, just before Christmas. So I started April, ended just before Christmas, Vine Street. But I had been, working on it previously when I had pitched it, so I had a lot of prep work done. And it's something I've been thinking about probably since about 2010. When I was writing some of my early novels, I had notes about this. I was thinking about writing a novel about the London gangs, like the Sabinian white gangs, but the street level guys in between the wars, how that worked for them, particularly those of Italian extraction, because when the war started, they were designated sort of enemy citizens or whatever, and some of them were in internment camps, and how all of that worked into the race courses and all that kind of racketeering work that they used to do. And then Peaky Blinders came out. And I hadn't actually started writing anything, but I thought that seems too close. You know, it's similar territory, the gangs, the race courses, whatever. So I left it alone. But it was always there, nagging away over the years. At one point, it was set in Birmingham. But it was the jazz that really got my interest. That was what I became fascinated with, this sort of backdrop for the whole thing. You know, the sort of the calypso music was popular at the time in the 20s, particularly in like Cardiff and London, where you had big ports and big West Indian populations. But the jazz was just starting to happen. American servicemen during the First War dropped the seeds of it. And then you had musicians from the West Indies who'd been in New York coming over to London and starting to play jazz. And it was a completely underground scene because the big bands of the day were all whites and none of the bands were integrated. So the black musicians basically had to have their own scene going on. So in Cardiff, you had Tiger Bay, Butetown, which was an unusual area. And I mean, ghettoization is and was a common thing in British cities at the time. But in that area in Cardiff, you had like 95% of the black population of the city living in this one small area, which is an unusually high concentration in that terms. And so they had a very strong West Indian identity and culture going on there. And a lot of those musicians started to come to London to make money, essentially, and playing these dive bars, literally underground clubs. I mean, basements were easy property in the West End to get on short leases. None of these places had licenses. They operated on bottle party rules. So they used to change owners and names, every month or so because they'd be raided by the police, or they'd just move down the road somewhere else. But this was the kind of culture I was interested in. It was such an interesting place because there were no boundaries to it. Anybody was welcome there because all of it was illegal in many ways. And that was kind of the texture behind the story I wanted to tell, and why I moved the book to London from Birmingham in the end.
And so we've talked around it, but do you want to try and give the listeners a pitch now of what Vine Street is?
I've done it again. Yeah, I've completely ignored the plot.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sold. It sounds like it's a fascinating setting. It's a really great place to set a story, though.
Yeah, just not where you set your pitch. But it's about two police officers who worked Soho in the 30s, who become involved in a murder investigation. And this is a real life murder case. There were a series of stranglings in 1935 and 1936 in Soho within a couple of streets of each other. A couple of the women were sex workers, some of them weren't. But the police never got any kind of handle on it. They couldn't connect the killings, but they also couldn't rule out that they were connected because they were so similar and in such close proximity. And in the middle of it all, a Latvian pimp called Max Cassell was murdered. His murder they solved. He was killed by his business partner, essentially. And all of this to me seemed there was the potential to connect all of this. Yeah. Like you could see why the police maybe thought it was all connected, either by one killer or through business connections. The first victim was also of Russian stock. She'd moved to France and then moved into England. There was a big people trafficking operation back then from the First World War onwards. Like during the First War, you had a lot of Belgian civilians coming here fleeing the German invasion, and more women than men because the men were in the army fighting the Germans. The women fled, and as happens with a lot of immigrant populations, they end up in a country, you might not speak the language, you gravitate towards a bigger city, and you end up in sex work because what else are you going to do? And it proved popular with local punters who it turned out liked an accent. So then you would get women putting on accents, or women from other parts of particularly more eastern areas, Poland or Russia, coming over and pretending to be French. This was sort of a strange thing that happened in the 30s in Soho. And there were a lot of them. So again, the connections were there. You've got a Latvian Russian pimp who was involved in bringing women into the country through France. You've got a Russian woman who'd lived in France who's killed. Her brother also lived in London. He's part of the Russian diaspora over here. So it was, it seemed authentic enough to be able to try and connect them into a murder story, a fictional one, out of the historical detail, and set in this fantastic place in Soho. And in the book, the story carries on. It goes on through the war, to the aftermath. The city was pretty wrecked, although Soho escaped not too bad in the end because there was no strategic target in that part of London. And eventually moves on to the 60s, moves through Cardiff and Birmingham, the Varna Road area, and also the Cotswolds, which I think probably at any given time is where the true dark monsters of the country reside. And eventually it all ties up just at the turn of the 21st century, sort of 7 decades after it begins.
So, I mean, with that, I mean, you clearly did a lot of research, pulling all these different threads together to create this fictional story. When you're doing that, how restricted do you feel by the actual facts, or is it, as you said before, you'll take what works and throw away the rest if it makes your story better?
You do the research. It makes all your research is good. You know, you do wide reading on it, because the better you know the actual history, then the freer you are to move around in your subject.
Mm-hmm.
When it actually comes to the writing of it, I'm not one of those novelists who will completely respect chronology. I'm not that. I mean, I know that. I think you find your own method when you do it. So Hilary Mantel will, say that what she strives after is an almost complete fidelity. She says fidelity to history, but I think she means fidelity to chronology, because history isn't fact.
No,
history is narrative.
Exactly, yeah.
So for me, the difference between historians and novelists is novelists will be open about the fact they're lying to you. Whereas historians are a little more, they're probably more responsible in their lies, but it's still a narrative. They project things, they choose what sources they're going to follow. There are agendas in it. You kind of have the establishment history that you read in your textbooks at school, which tends to be conservative. And then if you stray away from that, you're automatically called a Marxist historian for some extraordinary reason. So all of that is a narrative. There isn't that much difference in the writing of it, other than the historian has to respect time and chronology. And for me, time is something to be smashed to bits and destroyed by a novelist. You can do what you like with it. And I like moving back and forward. I like showing the future first, hiding things in the past, revealing them in the future, and vice versa, which is something that a historian can't really do without being disingenuous. So do the research, learn the history, and then that gives you the flexibility to do what you want in terms of your actual story, your story, as opposed to his story.
And you said that the books that you'd worked on before Past Life, that they were kind of more historical fiction than crime. So was this a kind of return to maybe the style of books that you started writing back at the start, and bringing those skill set but with all you'd learned in the past two books?
Yeah, certainly. I think I guess a blending of the two, really. I mean, it is obviously crime fiction, but the manner in which I did it is closer to the earlier books, which were bigger and I guess slightly more ambitious in scope and the way the narratives were structured, either moving back and forward in time or between multiple characters and perspectives. I mean, at one point I was going to attempt to write Vine Street not from the perspective of the two main characters, Leon Geets and Mark Cassar, but rather whoever they were in the scene with at any given time, I was going to write from their perspectives. But to be honest, it was too... I think that's a book to write if you're safely in the middle of a contract and you know the book's going to come out.
Yeah.
Not something you've got to convince somebody to, particularly when they've already said no once. That's not going to help you get them to say yes the second time. So I went, in many ways, the narrative is a fairly straightforward murder mystery narrative. But I wanted it to have that sort of, like a dreamlike quality as it moved through time.
And that's out on the 11th of November, is that right?
11th, yeah.
Excellent.
Assuming we still have, a distribution network and trucks and drivers and whatnot.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's up for debate at the moment. But and I also want to ask you, you also, as well as your novels, you've written some short stories. You were nominated for the CWA 2021 Short Story Award. Is that something you've always done, and do you find it a sort of freeing process to dabble in that?
I hadn't written a story in years. I mean, you write them at university, and it was a story that got my agent interested. To be honest, that was probably the last short story I'd written before I wrote Daddy Dearest, which was the one that was nominated. If that was, I do find it particularly liberating, because I think I don't have to plan a short story in the same way I plan a novel.
Yeah.
So where I'm very serious about the designing of the novel in terms of it being a gestalt, like you want, it's not just an assemblage of things, it has to be more than the things you're assembling. So I need a design in order to do that effectively. A short story you can pretty much keep in your mind's eye all at once. So, and I can start writing it, I can write the end, or I can write a bit in the middle, and I can just start patching it around. I basically just have a rough draft that I add bits to every day when I'm doing it. So in that way it's freeing, because it's different. It's like a little holiday away from the other writing you do. And also timing wise, that first one, that came just before I started to write Vine Street. So I'd been in this period where I wasn't really writing, and I was a bit glum about my writing in general. And this came up. Everybody works in it, knows that we're all mates. We came up with the idea together. So then it just seemed like a free hit, just write something, whatever you find yourself wanting to write about, because nobody's there to say, no, you can't do that. So in that respect, it was exciting, something new, and they've done okay. They've done pretty well, which is good, because we don't get anything out of it, but it raises money for charity, which was the point in the first place. But creatively, it is a sort of a little free space that we can be slightly more cavalier in.
And is it something you would like to, that kind of freedom and try new things? Would you want to go into scripts or to graphic novels? Is there anything else you'd like to kind of branch into?
I mean, scripts maybe simply because, like I said, I always had that interest in film previously, and I guess cinema was my first love in that way, because I guess when I was sort of like from 8 onwards, I didn't really read a lot of fiction. Like I'd read well pretty early. My dad taught me sort of before we went to school. So at school, they give you the reading, you zip through it, and they're like, okay, we can sit him in a corner with whatever. And then when I got to a certain age, I guess most of my reading was non-fiction, like boys stuff, dinosaurs, airplanes, space, whatever. But I shied away from fiction. And then when you're in secondary school, you kind of get, prescribed writing in English or whatever, which is annoying. So reading wasn't necessarily something that I enjoyed a great deal, probably until I was like 16, 17. But in that time, my love for film had grown. So, but equally, it's such a different art form. I don't know. I enjoy the sort of megalomaniac in me, I suppose, enjoys the complete control of the novel. So you haven't got to write a script and then hand it over to somebody else. You might do something completely different, or not what you saw in your mind's eye when you wrote it.
Totally.
The responsibility is entirely on you for the final outcome of it.
Yeah, is that we chatted before, we said similar stuff about that you do a book and it can be just you, and at the end of it, you've got a book that is complete and it's done, and if that's all it ever is, that's a whole story right there, and someone can read it, and that's it. Whereas as you say, the script, it's you pass it off, and who knows what's going to happen.
It's far more of a collaborative art form, cinema completely.
Yeah.
And so, what have you got next after Vine Street? Are you working on something just now?
Because I'm in the planning stages of something. I want to stay in London in crime. The 50s is what I'm looking at. So, you've got Rackman, you've got race riots, you've got robberies. There's a lot going on there. So I want to work it in the same way that I worked Vine Street, use real events, real people, and then bend them into the story I want to tell.
Excellent.
Do you ever go back to Boone? Would you write another book in that series, or is that kind of finished for you now?
I did sketch out a third one that we could have done that would have been it. I'm glad now I didn't do it, because I'm quite fond of Boone, as much as I like damaging her quite badly. But the plan I had for the third one was probably excessive. I'm not sure how happy I would have been about it afterwards, but there's the potential's there. She's always there, roaming around on her little missions.
What was the last book that you read?
The last one I read was Colson Whitehead's Harlem Shuffle.
Oh, nice.
Which is very, very good. Actually, I think crime suits him a lot. I wouldn't be surprised to see him returning to the form, because he's one of those novelists I've always thought who on a sociological level was very interesting. He writes about systems and the sort of institutions that bind people very well. But I think Ray Carney, the main character in this, is probably my favourite character I've read in any of his books. Seems far more human in many ways. And I think you get the impression Whitehead likes him a lot as well, the way he uses him. And I mean, it is crime fiction. It's been positioned as a heist novel, which, I mean, there is a heist in it, but it's not per se a heist novel. I think it's more like, the main character is the fence. So he's kind of the guy that's the glue between the criminal world and the city. And it's more of a story about New York, and particularly Harlem and its relationship to downtown, and how certain areas of the city are changing, culminating in the '64 riots, which came off the back of a young black man being murdered by the police. So not that much changed in sort of 5-6 decades. But yeah, I mean, his writing was, fantastic.
Yeah, no, I've not read that one yet, but I loved Underground Railroad and Nickel Boys as well. They were both brilliant. So,
fantastic adaptation of that as well. The Amazon TV show.
Yeah, the adaptation of Underground Railroad's amazing as well.
I'm ashamed to say I've got both those books on my pile to read, and I've not yet read them, but I will, because I've heard nothing but good things to Mark about them.
Well worth digging into. Yeah, I'm reading Piranesi at the moment.
Yeah,
amazing.
Another one on my list to read as well. Yeah,
through it. It's a pretty short read, but
I'd always meant to, and I've just read Jonathan Strange, and I loved it. So
it's magical, absolutely magical.
I'm looking forward to diving into Piranesi as well, which is obviously very different in length, if nothing else.
Yeah.
What about the last film that you watched?
What was the last film I watched? I said it was The Brothers Rico, which is an old 50s noir by Phil Carlson.
Okay.
Because I picked up Indicator, the Blu-ray label, sort of a boutique label. They're reissuing all the old Columbia film noirs in box sets, and that was the final one in their latest box set I watched the other day. I love old noirs, even ropey ones. I'll sit there and watch all of them. But yeah, Brothers Rico is pretty good. Richard Conte, actually from a short novel by Simenon. When he'd moved to America for a short while, he actually wrote some novels, still in French, but he set them in America, and the studio bought the rights to it and then adapted. It's slightly different to the novel, but it's good. Nice.
And what's the last TV show that you watched or are watching?
I am watching Maid on Netflix.
Oh yeah.
Margaret Qualley, which is absolutely fantastic. I can't quite work out why it isn't everywhere. It should be what everybody's watching. She's amazing. Her mum's in it as well. She's Andy McDowell's daughter.
All right.
Andy McDowell plays her mother in it.
All right. Okay.
Having a lot more fun than I think she had in some of the 90s rom-coms.
I have not seen her for about 30 years or something. Yeah.
I think that happens with actresses, doesn't it? They get to 40 and Hollywood are like, no, you're not allowed to work anymore now.
Yeah.
Come back to us when you're like 60
totally.
and we'll make you the crazy old woman in something.
Yeah, it's a pretty raw deal, I think.
Yeah, we've only got one role a year and Meryl Streep's getting that.
Yeah.
You're going to have to wait, I'm afraid. But she's embracing it with both hands. She's out of control in it. But Margaret Qualley, I think Margaret Qualley's 26, but everything I see her in, she just gets better and better.
Yeah, she is great.
And nice guys, like small roles like that. Or Yeah, she's absolutely fantastic.
Nice.
She's mesmerising in this particularly. She plays like a young mother who's trying to leave her abusive husband. She's got a 3-year-old. This is up in like Washington State, like the Pacific Northwest. And essentially she's homeless. So she's living in poverty. She's trying to navigate the benefit system in America, which makes ours look like the most generous thing in the world.
Yeah.
But it's not, it never sort of descends into poverty porn. The story's well thought out, and the cast uniformly is fantastic.
Fantastic! Yeah, I need to watch that. I've heard good things about that as well. That's just not enough time in the day for these books and TV shows to watch. And the very, very last thing we always do is a super quick fire either or. So I always say there's no right answer apart from one. But the first one is we'll go for Chandler or Elroy.
Good Lord. I would say I prefer Chandler, but Elroy is probably closer to maybe what I do, particularly in Vine Street. That sort of occult crime history of a city type thing. And maybe I'll say Elroy because I don't think I could ever be as good a writer as Chandler, whereas I don't think Elroy quite matches up to his own estimation sometimes.
TV or cinema?
I mean, in terms of form, cinema, but I like watching it on a TV because being in a room with 100 other people with their phones on, popcorn, is enough to drive somebody homicidal.
Yeah, I have to say, I'm getting worse as I get older. I love going to the cinema, but I cannot stand when people have their phones on or talking or. I remember going to see
just have an empty cinema. That'd be great.
That'd be perfect. That's a dream. Yeah, exactly. I'm going to see a film years ago, and someone had an apple and was eating an apple. It's so loud and it's incredibly rude. I think it's probably got worse through the pandemic because everyone's used to just watching stuff at home and take that bad habits in cinema. But anyway, enough about my rant about cinema stuff. Night owl or early bird?
Night owl. Mornings are not a thing.
Fancy restaurant or takeaway?
Takeaway, I think. I mean, I like cooking, so I'll cook at home too. But I like the comfort of being at home. I think once you've had a meal, particularly with friends, you haven't got to move anywhere afterwards or get yourself home. You're already there, and there's a sofa nearby. And a fridge with wine and beer.
The last one, real book or ebook?
Oh, real book.
Well, unfortunately, that was incorrect.
I will read, like you get sent proofs sometimes digitally. Although I find myself reading them, this is probably even worse, on my phone, not on a Kindle. Like a Kindle seems to be like another pet you've got to look after. Like, is the battery charged? If I put things on it, I just can't be bothered with it. Whereas my phone's always in my pocket.
Yeah.
So if I can, I'll actually try and get the typeset PDF as opposed to sort of a Mobi or an ebook file, so I can see how it looks on the page and read it on a device. But I would always rather have the physical book.
Fair enough.
I don't commute. You know what I mean? I work at my desk, so if I had a job and had to roam around the place, I suspect my views may change simply because you can carry around 1,000 books, on your Kindle, and that's easy. And I mean, certainly, if you work in publishing, editors and agents swear by them because, what would you do with all those manuscripts?
Yeah,
if it was on paper.
It sounds to me like what I'm hearing from you now. It sounds to me like ebooks probably are the winner. But,
I think in terms of business, I don't use them, but in terms of business, I can answer. I tell you, I was listening to a podcast with Miranda Duess at Viper, who I've worked with because she works with us on the anthologies. And she made an interesting point in that she kind of Chinese walls her reading. So she reads submissions for Viper on her Kindle, but the books she reads for fun, she always gets the physical.
Oh, okay.
So that the actual experience is kind of different.
That makes sense. Yeah.
So the important stuff she really needs to focus on, and really has to get to.
As you may have guessed, Eric's a big ebook advocate. So, yeah.
I made a throwaway comment. I nailed my colours to the mast on this topic about a year ago. Now I'm trapped in this character now that I have to always fight for ebooks. I do, but to be fair, they are wonderful things. Well, that was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that chat with Dom. And like a lot of other folk have said before, interesting point about, you're writing a historical fiction, pick a point and play with it a little bit. And it's, have that confidence to have a bit of freedom once you've done enough research to know what you can bend.
I think that's right. I think the research it's kind of similar to what Stuart Turton was saying earlier. Is you need to know everything, but then you can sort of throw out what you want because you know what you can safely throw out and what you have to keep in, kind of a thing. So, I highly recommend picking up Vine Street. It is getting all the rave reviews, probably be up for awards and stuff.
Oh, for sure, I think. Yeah, definitely.
So, definitely worth checking that one out. So, thanks very much to Dominic for coming on to the podcast. Really appreciate that. And next week, we've got another great guest.
Oh, yeah, we do indeed. The string of hits continues this season. We are chatting with Katrina Ward next week, who is perhaps best known at the moment for her kind of gothic horror novel, The Last House on Needless Street, which has been just everywhere the last few months. And rightly so. It's a fantastic horror crime novel, and I believe it's been made into a movie by Andy Serkis's company.
Oh, wow.
So it's very exciting. And she's got a new book, Sundial, out next year. So it's a lot of stuff happening there. It's very, very exciting for her.
Yeah, so do join us for that episode. Before we go, I will ask, as usual, if you enjoyed the episode, if you have a couple of seconds, if you could give us a rating and even a review on Apple Podcasts. We had a very nice review this week.
We did have a very nice review. It was lovely. Yeah, I have to thank Mum for that.
I think we were called Quietly Inspirational. Which,
yeah, that's right. Quite inspirational. Oh, wonderful. Whoever that was, thank you very much. Very kind of you to say it. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure they meant the guests and not us. But anyway. So yeah, if you could do that, that would be great, because it really helps us stay in the charts, and that helps us continue to get great guests on that you can listen to.
And of course, if anybody wants to get in touch, they can always send us an email to podcast@rightgear.co.uk, or send us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is @right_gear.
But otherwise, have a great week, and we'll see you next episode.
See you later.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please leave a comment down below, hit that thumbs up button, and be sure to hit that subscribe button as well, so you never miss an episode like these ones below.
And if you want to get in touch, you can always drop us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is @UKPage1, as evidenced here, and our other social media channels are available.
Otherwise, we hope to see you next episode.
See you later.